Well, all right. I'm happy to be able to join you tonight to go over some evidence that we have souls, something that always was a sticking point for me before I believed in God. At times I would sense my soul, and I realized that my naturalism had no place for that. And I had a fellow friend, atheist, who spent tons of time studying animal intelligence and would try to interpret what we were, what you experience in your mind and your soul as, really the herding instinct or, the mating instinct, different things. And it always just seemed very, very surfacey to me. And likewise, I ran into recently a student down at Ohio State who was talking to me after one of our meetings and said, he says, I've never seen a miracle. I've never seen anything supernatural. And I was like, yes, you have. In fact, every day. Because we have something supernatural, some non-material being inside of this body. We all intuitively know that. And it takes great effort to try to deny it. Let's talk to the Lord just a minute again. God, we pray that you would come here and really open our eyes into this matter, the glory of your creation of the human soul, and all of the implications that come with that. Just help us to think clearly about this tonight, God. Amen. Okay. I'm not going to get all hung up on a technical definition of the soul. I'm just using it in the normal way. I'm also not distinguishing between soul and spirit. Some passages in the Bible do that, others don't. Basically, I'm talking about the self, me, in here. And obviously, it's also understood to be non-material because it survives the death of the body. So it has to be non-material. The material part's still here. Our body weighs the same before and after death. There's no material change. It's the part of us able to think rationally, able to make free choices, unconditioned will, and therefore morally competent and morally culpable. Just as we would not hold an animal morally guilty because it killed someone. It's just an animal. We know that's not the case with us. And the reason we're culpable is because we have souls. Able to relate to God, able to be joined to his spirit, to ours. As Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 6, the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. And so this literally fusing of God's spirit and ours that happens when we are reborn spiritually. So that's what I'm talking about, the usual use. It's there in the Old Testament and New. As Rachel's dying, her soul was departing, for she died, and she named her son Ben-Oni, later changed to Benjamin. God breathed into the nostrils of Adam the breath of life, and he became a living person. There was the creation of the body, and then a subsequent breathing in of life. Hebrews 12 talks about how we all had human fathers who disciplined us. We respected them for it. How much more should we submit not to the Father of spirits and live? So our biological fathers gave birth to our bodies. God is the Father of spirits. Apparently, God imbues each human with a spirit sometime, probably before birth, because John the Baptist was filled with the Holy Spirit in his mother's womb. So it's quite early, maybe at conception. But and so that must be an individual creative act that God performs in every case of a live birth of a human. We're going to look at some evidence for the soul, but first we need to think about a couple of problems in this whole area as far as knowledge. How can we know? Because souls are invisible to the human eye. We're talking about it, and they're non-material, so they can't be weighed, they can't be photographed. How do we get a bead on this? A lot of the criticism, a lot of the anti-soul literature and lectures try to apply the null hypothesis to the existence of the soul, which I think is inappropriate. It's a statistical approach trying to differentiate between coincidence and actual causality, but it's only intended for situations where you can have measurable objective data, and that's not the case here. This is more of a forensic type of approach where we have a set of data in front of us and we're trying to organize them and figure out what's the best explanation. It's what you call inference to the best conclusion. It's different than an objective proof. What we have is the best explanation, a satisfying explanation, and that's often not understood in the criticism. Mind-brain confusion. In studying this for the past few years, I see an incredibly rigid focus by naturalists on physical damage to the brain and how that alters personality or perception. And so this is one way to get at how does the brain affect the person. And it does affect people and change their personality. For instance, to have a brain lesion, a tumor removed, an injury, an aneurysm. So in the mind of the naturalist, that shows that the mind is the brain. The mind is what the brain does. There aren't two things there. We are dualists. We believe in substance dualism, the physical and the spiritual. And that's what the Bible teaches. I think you could compare it to driving a car. We could take a car apart, spread out the parts, cross the parking lot, and say, we're really analyzing this car. I think we really understand it well. And indeed, we understand cars pretty well. But that doesn't really have anything to do with the question of who's driving the car, right? Yeah, the car's a machine, and it's being used, though, by a person to go somewhere. And so, too, even if the car, let's say, popped two flats on the same side, it would become very difficult to drive. It would be jerking down the road, tending off to one side. Yeah, you would be noticeably different driving than what you got when it was intact. What is that supposed to prove? It proves that the car is damaged. And of course, if the engine blew out, well, then it becomes useless for driving at all. And that happens, that can happen when people are in a coma, a stroke, and we can't get anything out of them. It still doesn't mean that the driver's not there. It just means his car doesn't work anymore. So I think it's probably an analogy that fits the relationship between mind and brain. Interesting case reported by Moreland of Dr. Wilder Penfield. Positive evidence that consciousness and the self are not merely physical processes of the brain. Penfield was doing research on epilepsy, and he electrically stimulated the brains of epilepsy patients and found that he could cause them to move their arms, their legs, turn their heads or eyes, talk or swallow. Invariably, the patient would respond by saying, "I didn't do that, you did that." Isn't that interesting? So here's the brain giving an order, executing and causing movement in the body, and yet the person is constantly aware what that is and what I am. Doesn't fit the naturalistic position very well. Burden of proof is a big area here. Who is it that has to prove their case, and how much do they have to prove it? We'll talk more about that later. Also, there's a necessity to trust our senses to some extent. Yes, our senses can be fooled. They're not infallible, and yet, if we don't trust our senses at all, we have no way to know anything. We can say, well, we could measure something, we could measure photons with a counter, a machine could count them. You would still have to read what the machine says. There is no getting around the need to trust the data of our senses. or we end up in a shoreless ocean of skepticism. The validity of cumulative evidence also comes in here, because no single line of evidence is going to prove the soul. But as layer after layer of the case builds, it's kind of similar to a court case. What Jim's going to be talking about later tonight, the use of inductive inference to the best conclusion. You know, you get into that court case, yes, it was his gun. He was heard to say that he was going to kill her. He was in the house. We can put him, it's his blood mixed with hers, you know, and none of those really prove anything alone, but as you start to stack them up, eventually the case reaches a point, not a point where it's beyond possible doubt, but a point beyond reasonable doubt. And that's, I think, where we are with the soul. Finally is the need for internal consistency. And we have some serious complaints against the opposition, the naturalistic opposition on this question, where they're using their mind to deny they have a mind, and many other inconsistencies as well, which betray, that internal inconsistency betrays falsehood. So, let's talk about the evidence, the positive evidence we have. I got, I think, 6 different lines of evidence to consider here. First is high-order consciousness. I'm going to explain these. Next is near-death experiences. Next are indications of free will. Then 2 new arguments coming from the field of physics. And then there's the discrediting parts of the no-soul view. Insurmountable difficulties with that view. And finally, linkage with every other argument that supports the supernatural or the inspiration of the Bible. Also then causes us to cross a threshold from the natural to the supernatural. And the existence of the soul suddenly becomes very plausible at that point. So, let's go through these. I'm just going to give a few examples in each. High order consciousness, okay? We're not talking about simple, basic consciousness where, for instance, you're aware of your surroundings. Like when you wake up and you look around, you realize you're in your bedroom. Before that, you weren't aware. Now I'm aware. I'm conscious. That rudimentary, basic consciousness, awareness of your surroundings is there for all animals are able to sense their surroundings. We're talking about high-order consciousness. And there's even a school of high-order consciousness which we should probably use high order, because their version of high-order consciousness is still very shallow, very low. In the criticism, in the naturalistic arguments on this, they always want to compress consciousness down to the most simplistic definition, that it's no different than what a frog sees at the edge of the pool is what I am, and refusal to see the depth, vastness of high-order consciousness. Let's read a few words from McCallum, see what he's got to say. High-order consciousness includes things like the ability to think about our earlier thoughts. That's called second-order thinking. You can be wrestling with issues over a period of weeks and going back to the conclusions I reached earlier, assessing those, refining them. No one else does that, just humans. It includes thinking about abstract things like math, relationships between cause and effect in a system, or what is true. No one does that but humans. These kind of thoughts transcend the tangible and the material. And here's one of the big differences between animal and human intelligence. Animals can be quite intelligent when it comes to tangible material things. In fact, I saw a special with a chimp working on with a screen that had elaborate symbols similar to Chinese characters in 12 different boxes. And 5 of them, one would come up, and 5 of them matched that, and he could almost instantly find all 5, way faster than the fastest human. So very impressive. But it always has to do with that. It has to do with the visual, the tangible. When we think about the intangible, we are aware of ourselves, not just in the sense that we recognize ourselves in the mirror, but that we know and can analyze our whole history. I remember things from before when I was in kindergarten, and it was me then, just as it is now. Every molecule of my body has probably changed since then, but still the self is a stable, knowable self, projecting into the future, seeing the trajectory of where things are headed, altering that. Inside is our mind's eye. We're able to see things without seeing them, whether real scenes. I can think of our trip to Idaho in the mountains, scenes I saw there, remember those? Or scenes I can make up out of nothing, just out of my imagination. Symbolic language is fascinating. This is so different than anything else in nature. It's not screeching, barking about my territory, a threat, a plea. Elaborate ideas encoded into sound sequences that can be received and decoded by another with a high degree of accuracy. Or shapes on paper can describe the sound sequence in letters for reading. Or if we we're exchanging elaborate abstract concepts with other humans, like reading a book or listening to this talk. Lengthy line, trains of thought, loaded with evidence, arguments. People who can't hear learn to speak with sign language. Those who can't see learn to read Braille with the touch of their finger. A lot of people will try to attribute in naturalistic thinking that the reason humans are advanced is because of language, that language is the scaffolding that has made a forward leap in knowledge possible. That, I think, is wrong. Derek Penn demonstrated that children who are deaf and were never taught to sign usually end up making up their own sign language, complete with hierarchies and syntax. So it's not the language that propels them upward. They're already up there, and they create the language to fit. Creativity and artistic appreciation. Yeah, as humans, we find ourselves so enchanted by music, art, literature, cinema, and other types of aesthetic creations that we routinely spend hours every day with them, dealing with them, dwelling on them. No other creatures like that. How strange that only humans engage in these activities and that create neither food nor shelter. And they might actually work against our survival in some cases. They're not really inferring survival of the fittest. The most primitive cultures are no different than the most modern in this regard. Everywhere we go, all alike. It's the music, it's the carving, the art, and people love it. And we know we are creating. It's so different. We say, well, a spider can create a beautiful web. Yeah, and it's exactly the same every time, too. In fact, you can identify spiders by the web. You can identify birds by the song. It's not creative like what we do. Morality, in spite of people's effort to deny it, we all know that some things are just plain wrong. And we may not agree on many moral questions, but everyone uses moral thinking and knows moral motions within. And when we find an exception to that, a true sociopath, we usually lock them up. This trait is exclusively human. We all know that animals are not capable of moral or immoral behavior because they're instinctual rather than free-choosing moral agents. The lion kills somebody on a safari. We're not going to execute the lion. It's just being a lion. It can't be moral. Why? They lack higher order consciousness. So that's necessary in order to be capable of moral activity. And so from many angles, and I'm just mentioning a handful here, I literally cut 20 different points I was going to make. Rational decision making. Every one of us knows what it is to weigh evidence, to consider alternatives, comparing costs and benefits, and then to make a decision. Not that we always take that much time. A lot of times we may lunge, just make an emotional decision. We are capable of this when we want to. Weighing alternatives, judging relative validity of different arguments, these require unfettered freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom to think according to rational inference instead of according to the laws of chemistry and physics, which are two entirely different things, clearly point to the fact that we're dealing with something other than matter and energy here. If we weren't able to freely analyze, sift, and appraise information before reaching a conclusion, we wouldn't really be thinking our way to a conclusion. It would be a chemical reaction, electrical impulses, unrelated to the question of truth. There has to be something guiding this process. Yes, using the brain, but something in addition to the brain. All of the features, I submit, that we just talked about here are incompatible with naturalism, but they fit perfectly with theism, and particularly biblical theism, with the doctrine that God created humans in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Genesis 1:26. To be created in the image of God has nothing to do with looking like God. It has to do with the features of personhood and of the immaterial soul, the mind, the ability to relate on that level, which according to the Bible is uniquely human and fits exactly what we see. Fantastic, extreme contrast with other animals. You know, this article I referred to earlier, Derek Penn et al., 6 different animal intelligence scholars collaborated on this overview of research on animal intelligence, and it's kind of a summary finding in the Behavioral and Brain Science Journal. They say that functional discontinuity between humans and non-human species pervades every area of domain and cognition, and they go on for 30 pages naming and showing the difference in area after area. Night and day, day and night, and absolutely blowing away the wrong and often dishonest efforts to compress that difference. If we took, nobody knows how many species of animal there are. We discover 10,000 more every year, but it's definitely in the millions. And so if we arranged all of those organisms from least intelligent to most, the difference between any 2 points on that graph, which should have, millions of points on it, would be negligible, would be so slight that experts would disagree about which dot should be where. And then all of a sudden, whom, humans come in, and probably the contrast is even much greater than what I've shown here. How can that be? Where does that fit into the Darwinian telling? Where are the intermediate stages? Where are the communities of human with only half as much intelligence? They don't exist. Everywhere we go, into the farthest isolated valley in New Guinea, intellect is alike the world over with humans. And it's interesting to think that there's no major capability gap like this in nature. Take any capability that you have, the ability to see. Our eyesight's so-so, nowhere near as good as a hawk, or an eagle. Speed, we can run about 20 miles an hour, so not very fast compared to a horse, let alone a bird, but better than a fish, maybe. So, and they would all be finely graded. We'd be in the mix somewhere. People say, well, there's some things just totally stand out, like lightning bugs have photoluminescence. Lots of creatures have photoluminescence. And again, we would have the same kind of gradient, very slight, between thousands, tens of thousands of species with bioluminescence. Nothing like this anywhere. Think about that. What is the explanation? We have the explanation. This is what it means to be created in the image of God. He gave us capabilities that no other creatures have around here. He's created other personal beings. We know the angels are there. They're like this. Michael Gazzaniga is a brain scientist, a neuroscientist, author of the book Who's in Charge? Free Will and the Science of the Brain. He's an agnostic, committed to materialism, but even he is amazed that people act like there's not that much difference between humans and animal intelligence. And he was talking about, one of his examples was human adaptability, where any ecosystem, any environment you go to on Earth, polar regions, desert, mountains, ocean, jungles, humans are there in great numbers, flourishing. Our next closest animal intelligence is the chimps, and they're endangered species because they can't adapt to any environment other than the one they're used to, and it's declining. I was watching a clip on chimps recently, and they showed some of the well-known clips where they use tools, they get to stick the fish, ants out of the mound. And in this case, we went and got a different stick that worked better, and they're like, there it is, right there. Choosing tools, adapting, picking the right tools for the right task. This is basically, and the researcher was kind of like, it's basically the same as us. We have a little higher quantity, but it's basically the same. And you're just like, are your powers of observation really that weak? Or are you just determined to believe this no matter what? I'm watching this on an airplane. On my laptop. And you're saying that's not much difference. Yo! Some pretty shady thinking. High order consciousness. It points straight to the existence of the soul. It points straight to the account of men and women created in the image of God, exactly what we have coming out of the Bible. And it points straight away from physicalism. Let's go to the next one. Near-death experiences. I've resisted this for years. This is actually the first time I've talked about it. I think it's somewhat ambiguous for a few different reasons. One is, it's anecdotal. These are stories being told by people who were traumatized. They were dead, near dead. And the story goes, in most of the cases, that they feel themselves and suddenly become aware of themselves, and they're rising up out of their body. They can look back and see their own dead body. And the doctor's usually fussing over the body, trying to revive it. And there are various accounts. Many of them meet a figure in white who says something to them. Others don't. But what's interesting is that as these accounts are accumulating, and we're now to the point where you have thousands of these that have been gathered and chronicled by the people studying this, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, they're able to recount details of what happened while they were completely anesthetized and even dead. And that, we have no answer for why that would be possible. One account, often several different witnesses collaborating on what happened. We could always wonder, is it a dream? Is it a hallucination? I just had recently a case where I thought I had heard something. I realized I didn't actually hear it. It was a dream I had. Maybe that's what happened. Well, I don't think so. If you've ever been anesthetized, you don't dream. And that point is made by the researchers in this field. The last thing you remember is going out. And the next thing you remember is coming back in. Nothing in between. I doubt seriously that these are dreams. Particularly if they can recount things that happened while they were having their dream. Here's an example reported by Patrick Glenn, God, the Evidence. This guy's Harvard PhD in physics, now a professor at Georgetown, agnostic, atheist, converted. He calls himself an ex-atheist, a former atheist now. And in this book, which is a good book, he recounts what brought him around. And one thing was fine-tuning, a cosmological fine-tuning, and another thing was near-death experiences. He recounts a case where this Dr. Michael Sabom, who's written on this a number of times, himself, agnostic, not a theist, did not believe the stories and was kind of pushed into it by a friend in his liberal Methodist church, and decided to meet some people, hear their stories. One of the things that he hit on was, he's a cardiac surgeon, would be that if these people are seeing what's happening while they're out, if they're lay people, they're not going to know what cardiac surgeons would be doing during a resuscitation. I, on the other hand, do know what they would be doing. So he set up these interviews and identified 70 subjects who claimed that they saw what happened while they were out. And he had them recounted, and he had some of the comparisons, the report given by the surgeon themselves, right alongside the report given by the night workman. A 52-year-old night watchman from rural Florida gave Sabon a detailed account of his open heart surgery, which he claimed to have observed from a vantage point above the operating table. He set the man's blow-by-blow account right next to, in columns, next to the record of the surgery. They line up. How would that guy get that? This is before the internet. As if he had visually watched the procedure. Well, I would just recommend doing some research on this. More and more people are kind of coming around on it. I'm starting to wonder myself. I don't think we can hang a huge amount of weight on it, but if there is such a thing as becoming conscious while you're completely sedated, that really does point to the existence of the soul, doesn't it? That's dualism. Your body's sedated, not the soul. You would have to become unhinged, though, from your brain, which would probably happen as a result of death. Well, what about indications of free will? We just don't have time to get into all of this. We know as theists, as Bible believers, our free will is damaged. It's not completely free, but it is significantly free enough for us to be morally culpable. And it can get worse, too, if we become addicted or habituated. But we still have the ability to freely think. That's our intuition. That's our experience. I feel like I chose the hamburger instead of the hot dog. I don't think anything made me do that. I think I could easily change my mind, too, as many times as I wanted to. I mean, it's really very intuitively settled that I'm freely thinking in here. Yeah, sometimes I do things out of habit or instinct, but a lot, and of course there are the autonomic reflexes and so forth that you don't have to think about. They're just automatic. But there's also the mind. I think the evidence for the mind include, for one, our ability to reason. As I mentioned earlier, if we don't have free will, reason wouldn't work, because we wouldn't be following the rules of logic and rational inference. We would be following physical law. And those are two different categories. And yet our reasoning does matter, does it work? We put a man on the moon. Or just look at your cell phone and think about what it can do. The triumph of technology shows that we're not just illusorily thinking. It shows that our thinking is real and able to accomplish concrete things. And that validation of human reason points directly to free will. Free will, on the other hand, points directly to a non-material self. How can we be free if we're made up of molecules and energy? operating under physical law. There's no freedom in that model. Something has to be not material, not subject to those same laws, and that is the soul. There's a good argument there. I lectured on it here 4 or 5 years ago, can we have reason without God? And the same argument which I got from C.S. Lewis and Miracles. What about physics? This is a growing area. Roger Penrose is an internationally top-ranked physics guy, tons of awards. He writes, co-authors with Hawking, and British professor. He believes that we're missing something entirely. And he gets hammered on this by other physicalists. He's not a believer. He's still committed to materialism, but he basically argues that known laws of physics are inadequate to explain the phenomenon of consciousness. He's like, it's just a swing and a miss, two different dimensions. We're not even touching. We're nowhere near. He goes through a number of experiments in his, this is one of his more recent books, where subjects decide to push a button that they measure, and they measure brain impulses. He says there's some clear indication of such electrical activity about a full second ahead of the time that the subject believes that the actual decision was made. So free will seems to involve some kind of a time delay on the order of a second. That doesn't really fit the purely physicalist model, does it? Why would there be a delay? Electricity, these neuro reactions, extremely fast, nowhere near a second necessary. And he wonders, he's like, something is going on during that period that we don't understand. Very puzzling experiences, particularly when taken together. They suggest that conscious willing appears to need about a second, and conscious sensation needs about half a second. So between the time that our eyes or ears take in data and the time that we actually consciously become aware of it, there's a passage of time there. Not easily accounted for by the strict physical mechanisms in the brain. They're much faster than that. Another area that he talks about and others are talking about as well is what's called wave function collapse. This has to do with quantum mechanics. All the research into the relation between consciousness and physics were focused on the most rudimentary aspects, feeling states, perception, brain states. None of them even try to come to grips with high-order consciousness. That's pretty much true across the board. They're mired in the details of how neurons connect in the brain work. So it's sort of like, we're studying a great novel by Dostoevsky, and we're getting down, and we're like, we're getting there. We now understand the paper. We see how it was made. The ink, we've identified the resins. We've identified the pigments. The way the fingers hold the pen. We pretty much got this, We can explain everything in this picture. Actually, you don't have anything. You completely missed the point because you're mired in the details of the production of it. You don't see that what really needs to be explained here is the intellect that would create a fascinating 1,000-page long novel. And that really has nothing to do with ink or paper. Different categories. Well, this quantum wave collapse thing is so complicated, and a lot of it's over my head, but I think it's fascinating. I brought a little clip. Quantum wave collapse refers to when it goes from that disturbance pattern down to just two. The wave property has collapsed and it's acting like particles. It only happens when a human comes and observes it. Even when the detector is left there, but like you said, we just unplug it or detach it from recording anywhere, it goes right back to a wave pattern. If we have people sitting in the room talking to each other but not aware of what's going on, nothing happens. It stays as a wave pattern. The minute somebody looks at it, it goes to the property of the particle. A lot of people suspect that something is going on here Well, something is clearly going on. We don't know what nobody can explain why this is true. But it's definitely human observation that causes the wave property to collapse. A lot of people are saying this could be the soul. Or this could be some spiritual, some dimension that we don't have a category for. This experiment's been around since the 1940s. It's replicated many times over. No one's ever been able to explain it satisfactorily. Of course, you have the extremists like Fritjof Capra, who wrote the Tao of Physics, big bestseller in the 80s and 90s. And of course, he's peddling a particular religious view, unity of all things and so forth. But we, of course, understand from Colossians that God upholds all things by the word of his power. That these physical forces are, in fact, the power of God, created by him and sustained by him. And the day will come when he'll release those forces. Well, I'm not going to say anything more on that. What about some of the discrediting parts of the no-soul view? Yeah, using their mind to deny they have a mind is really exactly what you see in books you read, such as Hawking's and Penrose's recent book, right before he died. And this book by Sam Harris on free will, where he denies the possibility of free will, denies the possibility of actual a soul. Let's see what he has to say here. And we are to discard all of that because it's all an illusion. Now, what's the evidence for that? It's really just loyalty to methodological materialism. Is the only reason why we have to discard everything we intuitively sense and feel in favor of saying it's all an illusion. How the hell would he know that either? That's another question. What if he's having an illusion? This is really asking a lot. This is why I think the burden of proof is a huge question here. Claiming to know things they cannot know. They couldn't possibly know. They have no way of knowing what he just said. He had no way of knowing that it's an illusion. All your belief and your brain processes being somehow, dualism. I guess there's hardly any of us left. Just a handful here tonight who are dualists. It's exactly what Jesus taught. When he said to the man on the cross, this day you will be with me in paradise. We know where their bodies were at the end of that day. So what was it that was in paradise? I think Dennett thinks our conception of conscious creatures with subjective inner lives, which are not describable merely in physical terms, is a useful fiction. He says the mind is what the brain does, but there's growing evidence that the brain is what the mind does. Neuroplasticity, a growing area of study, is showing that ways of thinking and behaving change the actual structure of your brain, forming new synapses that fire together, wire together, and so as a result, somebody who is addicted to cocaine has visually, strikingly different structures in their brain as measured in MRIs. But now they've also shown that the same thing is true with people that are addicted to video games. And that is, so there's no chemical actually interacting. Rather, it's the brain, the mind deciding to do something, and that is affecting the brain. And we can look for great growth in this area. Thomas Nagel, also an atheist, but he thinks people like Harris are full of it, and Dennett. He's reviewing Dennett's new book, Is Constant Consciousness an Illusion? He says, I'm reminded of the Marx Brothers line, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? Then it asks us to turn our backs on what is glaringly obvious, that in consciousness we are immediately aware of real subjective experiences. And he asks us to do this because the reality of such a phenomenon is incompatible with the scientific materialism that, in his view, sets the outer bounds of reality. He is, in Aristotle's words, maintaining a thesis at all costs. Boy, do I resonate with that. That's exactly what they're doing. What is the evidence that this is all an illusion? None. They offer no evidence. They just set it forth as a dogma. To say that there's no more reality than physics can account for is not a piece of mysticism, that there's more to reality than physics can account for. It's an acknowledgement that we are nowhere near a theory of everything, and that science will have to expand to accommodate facts of a kind fundamentally different from those that physics is designed to explain. He's not a believer. It seems like he might be on his way there, though. He's actually toyed with the idea. He says, I hope there's no God, but I'm starting to wonder. The theory of evolution, which in its current form is purely physical theory, may have to incorporate non-physical factors for a consciousness. Yeah. Claiming to know things they cannot know. And finally, too, that their behavior doesn't match the no-soul view. You know, here is Dennett saying there is no free will and that there is no free thought and that it's all physical reactions, yet he's writing a book to persuade people of this point of view. If their minds are completely determined by physical activity, why are you trying to persuade them? Trying to shift the burden of proof. This is what I think. Anyone claiming that my experience of myself is an illusion shoulders the full 100% burden of proof. It's on them to prove that. All of us have the same experience and we sense ourselves plainly, and they're saying, well, you're all deluded. Really? You better have some evidence to back that up. Because I feel like I'm right here and it's been working out just fine. It would take just as much as if somebody tried to claim that my sense of sight or hearing is an illusion. Oh yeah, you think you're seeing things, but it's all an illusion. Really? What's your proof? You better have stone cold proof to get me to abandon, because I believe what I'm seeing is actually there. And I believe what I'm hearing is actually there too. And I have a bunch of ways I can show that I'm not just imagining this. And I just think it's an incredibly bold claim that you have to deny every perception you've had and believe that it's an empty, but no proof comes forward. None is even attempted. Just empty claims, claims, and claims. Watch for it as you read in this area. Well, finally, any argument that sustains the reality of God or the inspiration of Scripture shows that non-material souls are plausible. You've already crossed the threshold from into the supernatural, so then what's so far out about believing in a soul? Some of my favorite areas, fulfilled prophecy. How do we explain that? That backs up the inspiration of Scripture. It suggests a being who knows the future and can't be accounted for under naturalism. Cosmological arguments, the overall cause of the universe itself, what Jim's going to be talking about tonight. Arguments from fine-tuning, becoming more and more persuasive the further we look into it. Origin of life, I'm convinced, will never be explained in part or in whole under naturalism. Not possible, because we have extra referential language and symbolic language being used in the life of any cell, even the most primitive, and that cannot come about any way other than to have been created. Well, same with things that show that the Bible's created. So, in conclusion, Does the existence of the soul necessarily require the existence of God? Yes. It's not coming from Darwinism. Mechanical models don't account for the futures of the soul. Darwinian processes are biological. They wouldn't have no way to leap from matter to something that would survive the death of the organism. And so it simply is inapplicable in this question. The existence of a soul would have to be put there by something else non-material, by God. No wonder they resisted so vigorously.
One question I thought was interesting. They say, do you think that the difference between animal intelligence and capabilities, mental capabilities, is a difference in mere degree or of kind?
Definitely of kind.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that article I referred to by Penn goes into that. It's not just degree at all. Entire vast categories that have find no corresponding thing in animal intelligence whatsoever, in these entire areas of cognition. So it's not just that we do it more, it's that we operate in areas that animals just simply cannot operate in at all.
Mm-hmm. Some were bringing up, too, in connection with that you see physical things affecting human ability to use parts of their cognition. You see there could be drugs that affect mood, physical injuries that can affect your ability to have awareness or consciousness. You brought up being sociopaths, being unable to experience or feel morality that will put us on par with animals at times. There's mental disabilities. Where is the soul in that case then?
Well, I would go back to the illustration of the car.
Mm-hmm.
My car might be so damaged it barely drives anymore, which is not a reflection on me as much as the mechanism that I'm working with. And there clearly is mind-brain interaction. So changes to the brain will affect the outcome. Mm-hmm. But I think those of us who believe in an afterlife believe that even people who are severely mentally damaged are going to be unhinged from that damaged brain, and that they will become at that point free-thinking, fully functional beings.
Someone asked, what do you feel like are the implications of a naturalistic perspective that denies the soul?
Well, I'm going to speak on this tomorrow if you want to come to my workshop. You know, people will say, well, all people are equal. They're not. They're not equal in size. They're not equal in hair color. They're not equal in gender, skin color. How's black equal white? They're not equal. And yet we say they're all equal. Why do we say they're equal? It's not because of physical criteria. It's because we believe they have a soul. That's what makes them all equal. Apart from having a soul, the only thing that's left is matter. Then, the bigger, the stronger are going to be like, we're bigger and stronger. No, we're not equal to you at all. You're under us. And it's hard to see how you would critique that.
It seems dehumanizing.
It is.
To remove the soul.
It is.